Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Bob Brunner, professor here at the University of Virginia, and I'll be your host and moderator for this event. I am delighted to welcome you all. We have a very timely topic for discussion this afternoon. I have a panel of content experts who we expect will bring some lively perspective to the discussion. The general subject is global capitalism and how the world became rich. Our aim is to explore the subject, to consider the role of capitalist institutions in the global wealth boom of the past couple of centuries, to consider their effect on democratic systems and the sustainability of democratic capitalism around the world. This panel is part of a series of events sponsored by the Project on Democracy and Capitalism here at the Miller Center of Public Affairs. We extend our thanks to the director of the Miller Center, Bill Antholis, and to the staff of the Miller Center for their kind hospitality. I'd like to extend our thanks to the panelists here today. Let me say a word about each by way of introduction. Jennifer Baer, to my right, is Associate Dean for Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia. Formerly the chair of the Sociology Department, she studies globalization with interests in trade and the political economy of development and the relationship between gender and work. She's spoken at the United Nations, the European Parliament, the International Labor Office, and the Collège de France about supply chains, development, and labor conditions in factories around the world. To her right, Fahad Ahmad Bashara is the Ramazani Associate Professor of Arabian Peninsula and Gulf Studies in the Corcoran Department of History here at the University of Virginia. He specializes in the economic and legal history of the Indian Ocean and the Islamic world. To his right is Mark Koyama, Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University and a senior scholar at the Mercatus Center there. He studies how historical institutions functioned, the relationship between culture and economic performance, and the emergence of religious freedom and the rule of law in Europe between 1500 and 1800. He's the co-author with Jared Rubin of a book I'll show you just momentarily. Jared Rubin, finally, to the extreme, my extreme right, your left, is an economic historian at Chapman University. He focuses on the historical relationships between political and religious institutions and their role in the economic development of the world. He's the co-author with Mark Koyama of this book, How the World Became Rich, a provocative title and a worthy subject given what newspapers tell us today in their headlines of the prevalence of growth concerns, economic growth concerns in both public and private life, in the public culture and the private culture of this country and of the world. The book, I would say, offers an impressive synthesis by the two co-authors and by the research of many on the title question, How the World Became Rich. So our aim in this session today is to stimulate all of you in the audience about the issues associated with global economic growth and its relevance for our reflections on democracy and capitalism. Second, we'd like to illustrate the richness of different disciplinary perspectives. Look at it. We have a business school professor, a sociologist, an historian, and two economists who also practice history. So as a prologue to this discussion, I'd like to bring you all up to some kind of familiarity with why this question of economic growth over a long period of time matters to us all. And I'd like our friends to beam up a graph. This graph on the horizontal axis shows the span of time from 1820 to the present. On the vertical axis, you have a measure of economic growth. Some would say wealth. It's the measure of real gross domestic product per capita. Real means it's all measured in constant dollars, in the dollars actually of the year 2011. But the measure is a standard measure by economists of economic welfare. The curves that you see in the graph display different performance by different regions of the world over the 200 years. And we could look at the graph. We could parse out the subtleties of the graph over more than the time we have, but I'll just offer 4 ahas for you that are worthy of note. The first is, and you'd need a handheld magnifying glass to see it, but if you look at the extreme left on the graph, the year 1820, you would see that Western Europe already was twice as wealthy as the rest of the world, as the other regions of the world. Many historians believe that this reflected the impact of the Great Industrial Revolution that had already commenced in the late 1700s. The second aha would just be that by 1900, by 80 years later, a region called the Western Offshoots, and that stands predominantly for the United States, for Canada, and for a few other countries. The Western Offshoots had already surpassed regions such as Western Europe and the rest of the world. Something had happened in the West that is worthy of note. Why was that? The third aha from the graph is that there was a massive boom in economic growth after World War II. And from this massive boom emerged rather dramatic disparities among regions of the world. What accounts for those disparities? The final aha is if you look to the extreme right of the graph, all of the curves seem to flatten out. It seems that the boom experience has begun to deflate. We should all wonder why that is. Now, I've asked our panelists to begin the discussion today with comments, any comments they'd like to make, either on this figure or anything else relating to the title or the aims of this session. And ask particularly what is the significance of the trends we see and what questions and concerns might they raise. After the opening comments, I'm going to invite the panelists to comment among themselves on what they've heard other panelists say. And then I'd like to pose questions from our audience. That's all of you, both here in Charlottesville as well, all of you, and there are many of you listening online. So how to do that? You will have seen at every seat here in Charlottesville a note card. And if you have a question you'd like to pose to the panelists, please jot it down and raise it sort of shoulder height, and a member of our staff will come by to collect it. All of the cards will be collected and then eventually handed over to me. For those of you online, you will see a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you'll see an opportunity to enter a question. You just press the return key, the enter key on your computer, and the question will arrive at our staff who are monitoring the inflow of such questions. So we'll have an opportunity to take your good questions as well. So let's begin. I'm going to suggest that we proceed in reverse alphabetic order, and I'd like our colleague, Jared Rubin, to begin. Jared, tell us about growth.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. This is a real honor. I'm a Wahoo class of 2002, so it's really amazing to be back at this very special place. I mean, there's so much about this figure and understanding the processes of growth, which I think are really important. And it's figures like this, which we often see as in our undergraduate days in classes, that I think get a lot of us really excited about wanting to explain what's going on. You know, the name of our book is How the World Became Rich. We want to understand this process, as seen right there. It's available for purchase. There's a number of things going on here. The first thing I want to make clear is the world is rich. It might not always seem like it. There are plenty of parts of the world that aren't rich by contemporary or historical standards. We're certainly not claiming that that's the case. The issue of abject poverty is probably one of the biggest ones that we have to grapple with as a society. And I think it's one of the reasons that many students go into economics and maybe even go on to graduate school. It's wanting to understand the processes through which countries and localities become wealthy to alleviate these problems. Now, what this figure shows up here, and figures like it show, is that this process has been uneven. It's been something that certainly happened beginning in Northwestern Europe, spread to certain parts of the world, and is continuing to spread into the 20th and 21st century with some recent hiccups, as was recently noted. One thing that we do in this book, though, is we actually even go back further than 1820. So if you see the beginning of this figure, the world was mostly poor in 1820. If you go back further throughout the rest of humanity, the world was as poor, if not poor. And the question is, well, why did growth happen when and where it did? That's one of the many questions that I think we need to understand, and it's where history really helps us understand these processes. What was important? What was important in certain contexts? Why did it happen when and where it did is not an obvious question. If you went back to say the year 1000, Northwestern Europe, particularly Great Britain, would have been one of the last places in Eurasia you would have expected modern economic growth to happen. China, the Middle East, possibly South Asia would have been much more likely candidates. So this isn't something that we can just kind of appeal to history and say, well, it was always going to be this part of the world that if there was a takeoff, it would happen there. So why did it happen there? Well, in our book, we appeal to many different reasons that have been brought up, all of which have something to say. So there's certainly the effect of colonialism. There's the effect of geography. There's the effect of what we call institutions, those legal and political parts of society that help shape the rules of the game by which we play. There's culture. There's demography. How many kids people are having? When societies have too many children, those children end up eating a lot of the extra proceeds of economic growth. All of these are important to understanding why this happened, when and where it did, and it's really understanding history, knowing why things happened when and where they did, that really help us understand both this curve, and I think more importantly, as was brought up here, we're starting to see a decline in this in certain parts of the world, which might have massive implications for that initial goal that I brought up at the beginning, relieving the abject poverty of at least over 1 billion people that are still living in it in the rest of the world. And I know we have a lot to say and we don't have too much time, so I'll cede to Mark now.
Thank you. Mark.
So what to add to what Joe just said? The Nobel laureate economist Robert Lucas said, once you start thinking about the problem of economic growth, it's hard to think about anything else. So I think that's the motivation for writing this book, that the scale of economic growth, the quantitative scale, is something we wanted to impress upon our readers, and the importance for growth. So we think growth is good for society overall. So it correlates with things like life satisfaction, life expectancy, better health outcomes. And we wanted to push back on kind of skeptics who point to trade-offs. So for example, we think things like climate change and other massive challenges the world faces actually alleviated, and we're going to be in a better position to deal with these problems if our economies are growing and if the world as a whole is prospering. So I think we were very much motivated by these questions, and we felt that history has a lot to say about these processes. So I'm happy to talk about the graph more and to go into more details, but I'm also happy to pass on my time so we can get some more questions in.
Very good. Fahad?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, first, Jared mentioned students wanting to go to graduate school to study abject poverty. Nothing will teach you more about abject poverty than graduate school, let me tell you. but one of the other things that we learn in graduate school, of course, is that graphs like this don't speak for themselves, right? As Mark and Jared both point out in their book and map out marvelously in their book, there's enormous debate surrounding these things, right? First, there's the obvious issue of colonialism, right? And the centuries over which wealth from the East and the South was transferred over to the West. And this isn't something that we can really discount, okay? It's sometimes very much short-shrifted in the economic history literature. And we actually have very little idea of what the long-term impacts of this might have been. But if the histories of places like Haiti and other countries in the global South tell us anything, is that it absolutely does matter. And saying that it doesn't is maybe intellectually dishonest and probably gaslighting at worst. And of course, it's not just the transfer of wealth from colonies in the East and the South to the West that matter, but also the colonies in this part of the world, right? In the Americas, the colonies in the quote unquote New World. Even the political economist Adam Smith recognized early on that this was one of the features that was fueling growth in Northwestern Europe. He could very clearly identify it, right? And there are debates, lots of debates surrounding the why of why Great Britain industrializes first, for example, and not, say, China. There's also the debate on economic institutions and their place in fostering growth, which ends up basing itself on lots of counterfactuals, like why did the Islamic world not grow in the same way, right? Which are based on some, I would say, flawed epistemological assumptions, and oftentimes really spotty research. And I hate to be the critic in the room, but we really have to point these things out. So I do have questions surrounding graphs like this. Primarily, I mean, one of the first questions I have when I see something like this is the question of data, right? Like, where the heck do these numbers even come from? I work on the Islamic world, and let me tell you, prior to maybe the 1950s, it becomes incredibly difficult to get accurate data on anything. There's nothing by way of data sets, and if they have them, I would really question where those figures come from. And when you have that data, you have to assume that there's a lot of underreporting of income for various reasons, right? So the sources themselves are not straightforward. And this is me, the historian, speaking, saying, look, we have to be able to interrogate our sources and not just mine them for data. Otherwise, we end up making some pretty serious assumptions about the way the world works. But my questions, the main questions that I have are actually not empirical at all. I would say they're epistemological, right? I can accept that maybe there's some clean data out there. I would really have questions about it, but let's accept the spotty data that we have. The main question that I have is, what are we counting in this category of wealth or growth, richness anyways? That's not straightforward, right? And this is the distinction between maybe economic history as done in economics departments and economic history as done in history departments. And we were sparring over this over lunch earlier today. But in history departments, we no longer, for the vast majority of us, I should say, no longer look at the causes of anything, because looking for causes, it presupposes all sorts of things. And instead, we look for meanings. What did it mean to experience these transformations? What did it mean to have this kind of quote unquote growth, right? Ultimately, is what we're after really the ability to buy more stuff? And if so, at what cost, right? And that's the question that we grapple with as historians. There are lots of assumptions that we're making here about growth, wealth, richness, and all of these I should point out, come out of the tradition of classical political economy as it emerged in Europe itself, right? European social theory as well, which we've taken and we've universalized. We've said this tells us about all of humanity. These are tools that are developed in a particular moment in time. They're not universal tools. They're not godlike tools. They're tools developed by human beings that come out of a very particular historical context. Of course, there's the immediate problem that not all classical political economists in the 19th century thought that this growth was a good thing at all, right? There are plenty of them who pointed out all of the problems inherent in it. There's no consensus here, except maybe in the discipline of economics as it stands today, which emerged out of a particular orthodoxy in that tradition. But there's also, again, the fundamental epistemological problem that these are tools that European thinkers developed to measure the very growth that we are now using to compare Europe with the rest of the world, right? So we are taking the tools developed to measure the supposed gains of the Industrial Revolution and then using them to talk about how and why others did not attain that same growth. That is, I'm not saying that there's a fundamental flaw there, that the entire project is worthless. In fact, I think it's a very worthwhile project, but we have to be able to interrogate our assumptions going into these things. And I'm not saying that Mark and Jared don't do it. Actually, they do it quite well in the book. But when we look at graphs like this, we have to be able to think about this. But here's the long and short of it, and I promise I'll stop soon. I say that all the time, and I never do. But this time, I promise. Right? Getting rich, getting wealthy, involved enormous transformations to society, right? It involved taking society itself and handing it over to the market. Not everybody was on board with that process. Not everybody gained in that process, right? Getting rich involved and continues to involve a total ravaging of the environment, right? And it still does that. And all in the name of having more things, having more money, right? There is absolutely no consensus that the world that we are living in right now is the best of all possible worlds, right? Nor is there any consensus that we should somehow be valorizing European and American capitalism. We may be rich in monetary terms. We may all be rich in monetary terms, but we only did it by sacrificing a lot along the way. And actually, based on some definitions, we might consider ourselves not very rich at all, but actually quite poor. I'll stop there.
So first of all, let me just say, thanks for the invitation to be here. This is a really lovely space. So I'm happy to be here, especially as part of this wonderful panel. I want to start with an observation, which actually harkens back to something that Jared said. It's also perhaps a friendly rebuke to the title of the event. And the observation is, of course, that the world isn't rich. Of course, in some longue durée sense, humanity collectively is certainly much better off than it was before the modern era of sustained economic growth. But the world in which today's humans live is obviously still marred by deprivation and poverty, and more generally, highly uneven prospects for individuals to live long, healthy, and productive lives. And of course, Mark and Jared recognize this. In some sense, I think the book is an attempt to explain precisely that unevenness across time and space, to understand why is it that some countries today are more developed than others, and why are they growing at different rates. But I want to start with the observation about the world not being rich, because I think, well, let me just say, I'm not an economic historian. I'm a sociologist of development. And so while I'm interested in understanding the sort of historical divergence between what's sometimes called the West and the rest, I'm interested in that question largely to the degree that it can help me sort of think about and understand the places in the world that are represented by the flatter curves on that graph. And I think it's important, again, to sort of just take a moment and remember that if we look at the bottom three lines, those flatter lines on the graph, it's where about half of humanity lives, right? So if we think about Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. So if we don't even include China and East Asia, right? That's still just over 50% of the world's 2021 total population of about 7.9 billion people. So having stipulated that the world isn't rich, in the rest of my time, I just want to make two quick points. One about the way we think about causes of development. And finally, I just want to say a word about development as a historical process. First, on the question of causes, I think one of the many strengths of this terrific book is that Mark and Jared's approach is that they're actually not trying to identify a single root cause for the development of the West. The first part of the book is really a survey. It sort of reviews the main schools of theory about what explains why economic growth happened when and where it did. And it looks at the schools of explanation centered on geography, institutions, culture, demography, and the history of colonial exploitation and imperialism, which is one of the points that Fahad was highlighting. Now, I think it's safe to say, without putting words in my panelists' mouth, that they certainly find some of those explanations more convincing than others. But I think one of the really important takeaways of the book is that, and I think we should keep it in mind when we're thinking about graphs like these, is that these factors sort of interact and intersect in ways that make an effort to kind of isolate any of them to sort of find a root cause very difficult and probably actually futile. That said, about causes, I do want to say something about culture. And I want to ask basically what we mean by culture, and in particular, maybe what economic historians mean by culture. So if I think about the famous definition that Douglas North gave of institutions, he defined institutions as humanly devised constraints that structure economic, political, and social interaction. And for North, those included both what he called informal constraints and formal rules. So for North, actually, the informal constraints includes a lot of stuff that most of us would think of as culture, right? So even the distinction between institutions and culture, I think, is something that it's sort of interesting to think about when we're thinking about sort of causes. But beyond that, what do we mean by culture then? Are we really talking about religion or belief systems? Are we thinking about cosmologies or ways of understanding the world? Are we thinking about, ideas of gender difference or racial difference and what those differences mean? So especially when it comes to culture, I mean, really when we're thinking about any kind of causal explanation, but particularly I think when we're thinking of culture, I really want us to think about mechanisms. So Fahad wants to talk about meaning, and I want to talk about mechanisms. And one of the reasons that I like still to assign Max Weber's Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism, even though lots of people think that Weber gets some of the facts wrong, is that it's a great model for having an explanation that centers mechanisms, right? So Weber has this idea that there's this set of beliefs, basically Calvinism, that are internalized. And it's that mechanism of internalization that leads particular people in a particular time and place to behave in certain ways that Weber argues is ultimately good for the emergence of capitalism, right? So there's a kind of a mechanism there connecting the set of beliefs to behavior to outcomes. And I get a little bit nervous about cultural explanations that might be marshaled to explain something like that graph, unless we have a clear understanding both of what we mean by culture and what the mechanism is that's connecting kind of culture to outcome. So for example, Confucianism is sometimes given as a cause of East Asia's success, right? The kind of the foundation of the East Asian miracle, the period of very rapid growth in East Asia after the Second World War. But then when the Asian financial crisis happened, Confucianism was also trotted out as an explanation for the financial crisis. The last question I want to raise quickly is about the nature of development as a macro historical process. Countries or regions are the units that we use to sort of measure GDP, but these kind of containers of national accounting systems can't really be cleanly separated from each other or from the system as a whole. So, countries interact, people move from one place to another, countries trade, capital in all of its various forms moves with ever greater rapidity across the world. And in addition to those units interacting, there's also a sort of system, right, in which they're all kind of located. And some of those changes, like globalization, I think are probably really important for understanding what lessons we can derive from the past to the present. So the factors that really explain why Great Britain developed in the late 19th century explain why China has grown in such a meteoric way over the last couple of decades. So I think we can still look to the past and to the factors that might explain economic growth over this long cycle of 250 years. But we have to recognize that the context in which economic development today is happening is different. Whereas in the earlier period, it was the transition or the transformation and application of new technologies to agriculture. And then in the later period, industry that really was sort of driving growth. The question is sort of what sector is going to sort of play that role today? And are the causes of development in an earlier era necessarily, they're certainly sort of important for us to think with, but I think we also have to be careful when we try to derive lessons from the past to thinking about what will best promote growth and welfare and human flourishing today.
Thank you very much, panelists. Before I give you all an opportunity to comment among one another, those of you in the audience, if you have questions and thoughts you'd like to bring forward, please write them down on a card and make them available. And those of you online, go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen.
Can I respond?
Panelists, yes, Mark.
So I'm going to, I mean, all the comments on culture and institutions very well taken, and I could respond to them, but I'm going to respond to Fayed's comments about his criticisms, I guess, of quantitative economic histories, at least as I understood your comments. So really, what we didn't come up with a specific figure, but we use figures like it. This is from a Madison project. And we know how these are created, right? It's quite easy to look up how these are constructed by modern social scientists. And it's entirely true that no one was calculating GDP per capita back in the 19th century, the 18th century. These are entirely products of Simon Kuznets, John Maynard Keynes, economists in the 1930s and 1940s. So we'd be the first to acknowledge that all these historical data are estimates. But the purpose of doing social science or quantitative work, and I think it is science, is to better understand the world around us. And so prior to the construction of national GDP estimates, you might be able to say this country was richer than that country, but that's a qualitative statement. You might be able to say this country produced more steel than that country. Again, though, steel is not the whole economy. So there's tremendous progress went into our understanding of how the economies work when people started, making these estimates. And Angus Madison, this is from a Madison project, Angus Madison was the first economic historian to try and systematically back project this data for historical errors. And as you no doubt, would say, there are loads of assumptions going on to these back projections. They really are estimates, right? But our estimates are better than no knowledge often. And these estimates can be verified, they can be matched against other surviving sources of data. So we have data on people's heights, we have data on real wages, we have data on consumption, we have data on life expectancy. So you can correlate these GDP estimates with those measures. And they're not perfectly related, but they tell a similar story. And the great thing about quantitative work is that you can see the assumptions, you can see the mistakes, you can see the errors. It's in an Excel file. If someone has miscalculated inflation for whatever reason, there's an incentive for someone else to discover it. And so recent work has actually greatly refined these estimates. So for example, Stephen Broadbury and co-authors have revised the estimates for China recently. And so I think criticizing the data on the grounds that, it's not as good as modern data, or the estimates are based on assumptions, is really totally misguided. The way to go is to do the work oneself and try and improve the data. So if there's a systematic flaw, one should point it out and try and do better and correct it rather than discounting it. And I similarly think that the idea that these measures are purely a product of some kind of Western economic tradition is entirely misguided as well. I think everyone likes stuff. Everyone wants to live.
This is not true.
Well, at least
no, this is patently untrue, Mark. Come on now. You're being dishonest now.
No, at least at a population level. So of course, with the individuals who want to live a religious life, they're going to want to give up material goods. But at the population level, I don't think there are populations of people, once they've been exposed to material welfare, that they don't want more. Now, they might not want always want the same stuff, but I think we can make a comparison.
No, we can't. Sorry.
So that's, yes, there's going to be an area of disagreement between us.
Yeah.
I think the people in the developing world want more stuff. Yeah.
No, they don't. Here's.
I think some do.
Yeah, well, look, maybe today we all want more stuff. That itself is an historical process, the process by which we come to valorize things, right? We have enormous numbers of historical studies that tell us that this is just not the way societies functioned before. People are not collecting things. People did not champion wealth in stuff, Mark. Okay. Now you're telling me that
So I'm using stuff in a general sense. So we can use resources to live longer. We can live with, some individual might want to live an austere life and not have many material possessions, but they're still going to spend their resources some other way. Maybe
People
they'll give
champion
resources to charity.
relationships. People champion relationships. People valorize society over things.
But you can fulfill relationships. So say you have an ill parent, right? If you have more resources, you can use those resources to help your ill parent.
Yes.
If
I
you're
think we're
living
stuck
in
on, I think we're
poverty-
stuck on stuff, right?
Yeah.
So if we think about something like, if you think about Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen, right? His book is called Development is Freedom. And whatever one, thinks about Sen's work, I think the really important point he's trying to make is that development is the ability to lead a life that you find meaningful. And that may not be about acquiring stuff, but it may be about expanding your capacity to live in a variety of ways, acquiring, more knowledge, more skills, more understanding, more time, perhaps for investing in things other than the acquisition of stuff. But I think Sen's point is that if we want to understand human flourishing, there is some growth is not the end all be all. It's not the whole story, but it's a part of it.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's important here is growth has happened, regardless of whether we find different types of meaning in the past or it not happening. It has happened. And I think some of what we're trying to explain too is stuff we have seen in our lifetimes. I mean, if you're old enough, South Korea was an extremely poor country in the 1950s and 1940s, and it is now one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And again, I think what Mark said, I think rings true. At a population level, that's really important. That yes, there are people that suffered because of this, undoubtedly. There's people that very well might want to go back to a different state, but at a population level, this is something that's not only really important, but when we think about then what happened in China, and it's happened in China really in my lifetime. When we used the term abject poverty before, there's 1.5 billion people in China, many of which are still very poor, but the vast majority of which are no longer scrounging around for their next meal. They have enough where they can satisfy other desires. They no longer have to go through that. The lowest part of the hierarchy of needs is satisfied. And I think that this is something that is one of the greatest human achievements of my lifetime. And whether or not, again, I mean, I think we can not even really agree to disagree, because I actually think that the way that we're viewing this and you are actually complementary and can be complementary, because we're very much taking a positive view, meaning we're not trying to place a normative statement on whether this is good or how people view this when they're involved in it. It has happened, and I think when we abstracting away from that graph, because I actually think when we're thinking about stuff, moving per capita income from $30,000 to $40,000 is not really what we're talking about. We're talking about moving per capita income from $300, less than $1 a day, to a few $1,000s, which is fundamentally different. That, in a sense, I think was what we want to explain. I think not just we, but economists, most economists that are really concerned with these issues, because yes, I mean, I agree that, and actually the biggest point that you brought up that, we do mention in the book too, is there are costs to this. And clearly climate change has been really important. As Mark noted, hopefully growth will actually help us get some of the tools to address climate change. But man, if climate change ends up being really damaging the earth as it very well might, yeah, maybe it wasn't worth it in the end. And in the end, that could be the next chapter in all of this. We're not saying that this is the end of history, to use a term from a famous historian. And I think that these are questions that we all kind of have, that when we look at the rest of the world, when we look at the poorest parts of the world, what can we do? And again, I think one point that was brought up that's really important is that we can't just look to history and say it happened this way in history. We have to repeat that. That's not the way it works. Things are very culturally contextualized. institutions are different. The way people view the world is different. So when the question was brought up, what do we mean by culture? I do actually just briefly want to talk about that, because the worst of, I think, economics, as well as more so the social sciences especially the early 20th century, would look at a figure like that and say, oh, there's just something about European culture that was really good, and everyone else in the world, is backwards or whatever. And that's just it's not even that it's offensive, it's just wrong. When we're thinking about culture, we're thinking about these shared ways of viewing the world that then do impinge on the types of institutions, the types of incentives people have to do certain types of things. A big one that's been brought up recently, say, is trusting other people. When you have a general trust of other people, regardless of whether you really know them or not, that's going to help commerce, right? And we know from surveys, from a host of studies, that the type of trust that people have of other people that they don't know differs immensely across the world, and not surprisingly, correlates very strongly with economic development. So these are the types of things we're talking about. We're definitely not saying, and again, not just because it's not offensive, but because it's not true, that there's something superior about one culture versus another.
Right. Can I just clarify one thing, which is tiny agree with everything Jared said. And I didn't mean to valorize GDP, which I think is your original criticism.
Yeah.
In the sense that we should always be obsessed about GDP. I was just motivated to defend it because I think it's underappreciated by non-economists. But I agree that people may want to consume their riches in a form of greater leisure time, right? And then if people take more leisure, then measured GDP might go down, but human health, welfare, and happiness could go up. So I'm certainly on board with a broader conception of human well-being. I think it correlates well with GDP growth, but it's not the same. And there can be periods or episodes where the two go in different directions. Like, you can imagine periods of very rapid growth where people's living standards are not getting much better because they're crowding in to cities and there's a lot of pollution. So that was just a quick caveat.
Before I turn to some questions from the audience, which are actually quite good, let me ask one of my own, which is, Mark and Jared, in your book, you say that economic freedom is correlated with per capita income. So why might that be? And a related question would be, is political freedom correlated with economic income?
So economic freedom is correlated with economic growth because allowing people to allocate their resources as they best see fit is going to be most conducive to what economists would call allocative efficiency. So you're not making decisions on the behalf of people. You're allowing them you're allowing an entrepreneur to, if he spots a particular opportunity, he can make that decision to make that investment or set up the firm or not, or hire the worker or not hire the worker. So I think the insight goes back to Adam Smith. It's kind of fits in F.A. Hayek's writing. So I think that's fairly straightforward. Now, we don't think it's the be all and end all of economic growth. So we're not necessarily saying growth is always and everywhere associated with some kind of laissez-faire economy, but we think it's an important ingredient. Some level of economic freedom is clearly an ingredient which is vital to economic development. If it's not complemented by innovation, then you might not get a very rapid growth, at least historically, but it's an ingredient for sure. Now, political freedom is a little bit more tricky because political freedom is associated with things like democracy or the right to protest or the right for free speech. And so in the long run, we do think those matter greatly for economic development through that channel, through innovation, in fact. So you can have economies which are repressive politically, which grow fast, particularly if they're experiencing what economists call catch-up growth. So if they're importing technology from more advanced economies, and it's just a question of investment and mobilizing resources, then you can get very rapid growth in the Soviet Union or certainly in China in the last 30 years. But we think, zooming out in a long-run perspective, political freedom, some measure of political freedom for a broad swath of the population is important, because otherwise it's hard to see where innovation comes from. So we spend a lot of time actually on the Industrial Revolution and the conditions which led to it in Western Europe. And we think that the degree of freedom, not for everybody by all means, for a narrow group of people, but the degree of freedom to innovate was critical. And so we really build on Joel McKeer's work on on science, innovation, and kind of the intellectual atmosphere which emerged prior to industrialization. So that's a long-winded answer, but I think economic freedom, political freedom are both very important. They matter in slightly different ways.
A question at the interface of culture and growth. A very good question from the audience. I'm going to modify this slightly, but the question is, how do religious systems, and we might say cultural systems more broadly, in which half the population are unable to work, affect economic and political development?
I can take this as something I've worked on. Much of my work is on this interplay between religion, religious views, religious institutions, and economic development. Now, certainly, when we're thinking historically and actually in the present day as well, yeah, I mean, the question's obviously getting at certain types of cultural systems that were prevalent across the world. No part of the world has ever had a monopoly on the suppression of women. It's been not just religiously based, but culturally based throughout much of humanity. These cultural values, I mean, clearly we should say the shift in such values were necessary for certain types of growth to happen. When it comes to culture and religion more generally, one thing that we bring up in the book, and both of our writings have hit on at other points as well, is that it's not just culture that matters. It's not just that one society has this way of viewing the world differently than another society, and that can explain everything. When culture really matters for growth and the way we're thinking about growth is how it interacts with these types of institutions that a society has. The types of the question that was just asked of Mark, in fact, when we're thinking about political freedoms, when we're thinking about economic freedoms, these are things that are going to be imbued by and affected by the culture of a society, and frankly, oftentimes the religion in the society. Sometimes religious authorities might have more power, in some political power in some societies than others. That means that their wishes are going to be imposed in terms of public policy, things like this. When that's the case, you're just going to get different types of policies than you are when religious figures have less political power. This matters for economic growth. Public policies can matter big time for economic growth, but understanding why we see differences across the world is really the question that we're interested in here, and that's where we think that, and well, I guess I only speak for myself here, but it's where at least I think that religion has its biggest impact on economic development, and at least is partially contributed to what you see in that graph. And to be clear, we don't think there's one explanation that helps us understand that there's a lot going on.
Can I just put an asterisk to that? And I hate to be the critical voice in the room again, but religion or culture are neither static nor bounded, right?
Sure.
These religions change over time. Yeah. Religious beliefs, religious practices change over time. Cultural beliefs absolutely change over time, right? And they are unbounded. They are not systems as such. There might be particular cores that we associate with them, but then there's a whole range of practices. There's a question within the field of Islamic studies of what is Islam anyways? What do we mean by Islam anyways? And there is the normative sort of orthodox tradition of Islam. And some might say that is what we mean by Islam, but that is just one strain of Islam. That is not, and then there's the other side of the debate, which is Islam is what Muslims do, right? Islam is what Muslims do. And that in some ways is a more historically faithful, although maybe theoretically a bit more promiscuous definition of what Islam might be. It's a bit too loose. But what it tries to accept is the sort of the plurality of beliefs, practices, institutions within this thing that we have demarcated as the Islamic world, generally speaking. That's
Might I just briefly add to that? I mean, I completely agree, and I think understanding why cultures change and why religion change. I mean, I think that's very obvious. It's almost taken that they do change, understanding why they change, and perhaps the way these other things that we have identified, we should think about it kind of almost as a circle, right? You might get demographic change that might affect religious change, then that affects institutional change. These things are very much feeding into each other, and it's really the process of change, in some cases or lack thereof, that is really what we're trying to explain. And your point is very well taken.
I think it's also hard to sometimes to disentangle cause and effect, right? So
Totally.
going back to the role of trust, right? Is it in fact a precondition of economic growth, or is it in fact that more developed societies are generally likely to have higher levels of trust? And the same thing I think could be said of changes in belief systems or changes in gender norms. So although we try as social scientists, I think, to do our best to disentangle those, there are in the real world, obviously, really complicated recursive sort of dynamics that make it hard to kind of disentangle.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and I think this goes back to something I was saying that that's the main reason, or at least in my opinion, why we can't just take what happened in history and say, well, it happened there and it's going to, and it led to Y effect in history. It's going to lead to the same thing and now, because it's complicated. Just because even if you think you've shown that one thing led to something in another period, even if you take that as true, it doesn't mean that's going to happen now. Or
right.
Yeah.
Another great question from the audience. It seems like inequality is missing from the conversation. Shouldn't we be talking about, quote, how a few people got really, really rich?
So I'm happy to take that one on and have a controversial position on it, which is there are tons of books on inequality, and there are a lot of inequality is obviously big, and since Thomas Piketty's book, it's taken over a lot of attention. So I think the key thing is, from a historical perspective, even the richest people in the past lacked a lot of basic technologies, access to healthcare, which we mostly take for granted today. So from a historical perspective, it is actually the ordinary middle-class people in developed countries, and even now upper middle-class people in developing countries, who are actually historically relatively rich, not in terms of being able to lord over minions or slaves or have big plantations, but in terms of access to penicillin. The Baron Rothschild died when he cut his toe playing tennis in the 1820s. So because of gangrene. So actually, our point is actually that in some dimensions, resources are relatively abundant to many people. Now, inequality is a slightly different issue. In some sense, there's always going to be some level of inequality in societies, and there's always going to be status differences between people. In some sense, it's the nature of human beings that we're envious and competitive to some varying degrees, of course. Now, how big a story is inequality here really depends on what you're interested in measuring. So like consumption inequality is much less than income inequality, which is much less than wealth inequality. And we felt that we wanted to tell the story of economic growth, and that's not unrelated to the story of inequality, but they are separate stories. Inequality was very high in Industrial Revolution Britain. It went down, and it's risen a little bit since the 1980s. In the United States, you had a high point of inequality in the early 20th century. The so-called robber baron era declined greatly after the Great Depression, New Deal, World War II, and then it's risen since the 1980s. But that's not, you can have economic growth with different levels of inequality, and I feel Jared can disagree on this, but I feel that we're actually talking about inequality all the time, and it seems to be very salient to us. And I want to talk about growth because for me that's more central, more interesting.
Yeah, I'd just like to add. I mean, I agree with much of what Mark's saying. I mean, clearly we know that there's not just inequality, but rising inequality within certainly the West. But I think one thing that we can point to too is if we take a worldwide perspective and we think about the lot of the poorest in the world, if that's really what we care about. And I also, to be very clear, the type of stuff we're doing and the type of stuff economists typically do does not really have, we don't take a normative stance on what a just society could be. What we are, we obviously have opinions on what a just society should be, but what we're trying to do is say, well, put our opinions aside, this is what happened, and then we can use that information to justify our opinions, or in a discussion like this, use this to really go back and forth. And I think that one thing that's really important when we think about inequality, and now I will get normative because this is how I feel, I'm much more concerned about worldwide inequality. And it's not, and when I say worldwide inequality, I don't just mean how much wealthier people in the US or Luxembourg are than the poorest people in, say, sub-Saharan Africa. What I really mean is, what is the level of wealth in or income in sub-Saharan Africa? that is what I think is much more important than just the, say, levels of income inequality within the United States, which, to be very clear, have been rising. And I think from a public policy standpoint is, again, to my opinion, is something we absolutely should be addressing. And we should be using the tools of public policy to try to alleviate some of the worst aspects of inequality. But this is also something that, again, I think in many ways can be viewed as a slightly different issue. That
global inequality has gone down hugely, largely due to the rise of China, and to some degree India and other countries.
Yeah.
I would just add that I think, as a sociological development, I think it's incredibly important, actually, that inter-country inequality has declined, largely because of the rise of China and to some degree India. But I think the political consequences of intra-country inequality are enormously important.
For sure.
And your average voter, let's say, doesn't think about whether or not they're better off than Baron Rothschild with his cut toe, right? They think about what they perceive to be either an unfair or a fair system. And so I think in terms of the conversation about democracy and capitalism, the question of intra-country inequality.
I think that's a great point, and I totally agree. It's perceptions of fairness are very important. I think and this is again not Jared's stake, so you don't have to cut it home. This. My particular position on this is that people. So say I'm from the United Kingdom, and there's been a lot of news recently about this kind of slowdown in growth which has been observed. And I think the perceptions of inequality and the slowdown of growth are very much correlated and very difficult to disentangle. Because if you're an ordinary person in the United Kingdom or indeed the US, what you see is your real income not going up very much, and you see the cost of living going up, and that makes you dissatisfied with politics. And you compare that. You might well compare that with either your expectations, how well you expected to do, how well perhaps your parents' generation did, how well your friends and colleagues are doing. And so I think those matter greatly, and I think they're responsible for things like the rise of populism and like discontent with the political system. I'm a little bit skeptical of how they relate to the precise measures economists like to bring out about the Gini coefficient or how well the very rich are doing. Because I think those measures actually can be a little bit misleading. So I think often it's a crisis of growth as well as a crisis of inequality.
We have just enough time to do a quick round robin 20-second closing comment from each of you. How much trouble is democratic capitalism in?
How much trouble is in 20 seconds?
This is a great closing question from you.
I think it's an important question, and it's one of the questions that will be clearly dominating the discourse for the next generation. And there are big issues that need to be dealt with, and one of the last ones that was brought up, inequality within country. Inequality is actually probably more important for the future of democratic capitalism than between country inequality. Again, this is not something that our book addresses as much. We're more concerned with the between country because but it's a different issue. And I think that said, one does impinge on the other, and I paint myself an optimist typically on these things, but I think there's real reason to be worried in the near future.
So we're very optimistic in the book in general about GDP growth, but actually now there is evidence for a slowdown in growth across many developed countries post really the financial crisis. So post the financial crisis, something seems to have been off about the recovery in many places. I think the US is much more insulated than other parts of the world, but in Europe you can see that it's pretty stark, especially with the problems facing the energy supply. So I think so for me it's really the slowdown in growth which poses the challenges.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to say about democratic capitalism as such, but in the history of global capitalism, the rise of global capitalism, there are winners and there are losers, right? And there's no way of accounting for the winners without saying that people had lost along the way, and that we have to be able to take that, interrogate it closely, and interrogate our own assumptions about what we value in this process and what has been lost. And this is the difference between looking at causes and looking at meanings.
I think in some sense, the question presumes a relationship between capitalism and democracy. And there are countries that we could consider capitalist or not democracies.
Absolutely.
So I think that's an important modification. But I think I'm possibly a little bit less optimistic, certainly than the book, although Jared, I have to say you're less optimistic in person. And so I think it's something that we should all be, certainly concerned about moving forward, particularly in the context of a slowdown in growth. But even kind of before that, I think there were distributive dynamics in terms of global capitalism that I think raised questions about the degree to which at least the winners are being sort of compensated in a manner that will allow us to sort of move forward with some degree of social cohesion.
Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, please join me in thanking our panelists. Keep your eyes peeled for further events offered by the Miller Center. Have a good evening.